Good evening and welcome to Undaunted, bringing into the news untold stories. I am Star Smart. Let's begin. Tonight, we come to you at a time when the temperature of our struggle, the struggle of Ambazonia, is rising, and so too is the desperation of those who seek to suppress Ambazonia. Now, across Ambazonia, disturbing patterns are emerging, from calculated military operations disguised as routine arrests to silent invasions being coordinated across Ambazonian borders, to the continued imprisonment of the truth-tellers, journalists. Today has exposed the growing complexity of the Ambazonian war being waged against Ambazonians, which is under siege not just from bullets, but from betrayal, blackmail, and brutal silencing. Communities are crippled by fear as foreign-backed forces inch closer under the cover of night. The people of Ambazonia are being dragged from their homes in broad daylight, and the journalists remain buried in dungeons. Proof that the occupation of the colonial army and the colonial forces fears not just resistance, but the power of truth. Yet in the face of these escalating tactics, the cries for justice are no longer just Ambazonians alone. Today, voices from beyond the borders have begun to echo the pain and demand answers, signaling that the conscience of the international community is slowly awakening. As we reflect on the state of Ambazonia this evening, what becomes clear is this: the colonial regime is tightening its grip, but the world is also watching, and so are we. Every raid, every abduction, every backdoor conspiracy, as well as every ongoing unplanned and unmasked plans shows further a regime running out of cover. Tonight's broadcast is not just news, it is a call for awareness, vigilance, and unbroken resolve. So stay with us as we walk through the unfolding events that mark yet another defining chapter in Ambazonia's national report. We'll take a look at the prime headlines on Undaunted tonight. We see a young man who was found dead after being pulled out of a drinking joint for drinking brasseries brewed beer at Ayaba Street in Bamanda on Saturday, May 10th, by men with guns. We also see Mbororo militias poised to invade Ambazonia from Nigeria with backing of La Republique. La Republique forces also launch another wave of what they call Kalekale in Mautu and Oweh, dozens abducted in broad daylight, dozens of Ambazonians. Pope Leo XIV calls for the release of detained Ambazonian journalists in La Republique dungeon, as well as moving to the African scene, where we're going to take a look at Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore slamming French media. And with the rest of the news across the globe, white South Africans, Afrikaners arrived in the United States amidst controversy over refugee status and racial segregation. With that, we'll head on into the full briefings of Undaunted tonight. Do stay with us. Well, an incident unfolded in the city of Bamanda, precisely at Ayaba Street, on the night of Saturday, May 11, 2025, resulted in the death of a young man by the name Funwi from Bafut. According to eyewitnesses, Funwi was forcefully removed from a drinking spot on Ayaba Street for consuming a brand brewed by Les Brasseries du Cameroon, fondly called a contraband drink. Now, witnesses' account holds that men with guns dressed in civilian attire abducted him, issuing threats to him stating they'll treat the consumer as well as the sellers. But the following morning, Funwi's lifeless body was discovered on Bafut Road. At press time, no individual or group had claimed responsibility for such a killing. Funwi, a married father of 3, lives behind a grieving family. His body has been taken for burial as efforts to identify those responsible for his death continues. Ayaba Street, where the incident took place, is overwhelmed with the presence of the colonial military. The question on many lips is, who could have perpetrated such an act in a highly colonial, militarized area? And to what purpose? Could it be another agenda of trying to paint the struggle in a very grim light? What could it be? That question leaves lingering. Well, on to another concerning Ambazonia. As we know, for years, Ambazonians have endured the brutal tactics of colonial La République du Cameroon. From scorched earth policy, operations, and arbitrary arrests to targeted assassinations, now disturbing news intelligence has revealed a dangerous shift in La République's occupation playbook: the use of foreign militias, specifically armed Fulani Mbororo fighters, to escalate the war on Ambazonia. Well, credible sources confirm that hundreds of armed Fulanese Mbororo, locally referred to as Bodabe, are currently hiding in the bushlands across and around Gambu, a Nigerian border town, and we wonder their mission if it's to illegally cross into Ambazonian territory and wage war alongside La République forces under the guise of recognition warfare. But there is a growing concern that the Nigerian government may soon permit these militias to cross into Ambazonia, raising urgent security alarms amongst border communities and defense units. Well, in response, all Ambazonian State Army brigades have been placed on a very high alert. Citizens living in and around Gambu, as well as those in Oweh, Ako, Misage, and Ndu local government areas, are strongly urged to remain vigilant, report suspicious activity, and support early detection efforts. Now, further intel reveals that some of these Mbororos are already undergoing military training in Binshua village in Nkambe local government area, supervised by La République forces. The strategy appears to be twofold: deploy trained fighters from within and reinforce them with militias crossing in from Nigeria to carry out coordinated assault on Ambazonian civilians and self-defense units. Local sources have identified several colonial collaborators accused of sponsoring and coordinating this operation, including Ngala Gerald, colonial MP, Mayor Musa Sheimfo, Mayor of Nkambe, colonial mayor as well of Abu Bornu, the colonial mayor of Ndu, as well as the colonial divisional officer for Ndu. Now, these individuals have allegedly facilitated recruitment, training, and logistics in collaborations with La République Military Command. Now, this isn't just a warning. It is a confirmation of La République's deepening reliance on proxy militias and cross-border warfare to undermine Ambazonian sovereignty. The use of the Fulani Mbororo as a destabilizing force seems to be a calculated tactic designed to sow fear, divide communities, and shift blame away from the regime's hand in ongoing violence across Ambazonia. While Ambazonia's survival demands unity, vigilance, and proactive defense, the people must resist not only the guns of occupation, but the silent infiltration of foreign terror supported by the colonial actors. But with that, we head on to another concern. Speaking of the violence in Ambazonia, we know since the start of its brutal occupation of Ambazonia, La République has weaponized arbitrary arrest as a tool of control, intimidation, and subjugation. What began as isolated crackdowns has now become a normalized part of life under occupation, known locally as what is called Kalekale. In village after village, civilians are abducted without cause, often never to be seen again. Families are left in anguish, forced to either pay bribes more like ransoms for the release of their loved ones, or mourn in silence when they return as corpses, or not at all. Now, over time, this systematic abuse has become one of the most feared forms of state-sponsored violence, used not just to break the spirit of resistance, but to generate revenue through ransom-style extortion. It is not justice, it is organized terror. Today, yet again, Kalekale has struck the village of Mautu and Oweh, which have become the latest targets in La Republique's ongoing campaign of abduction and brutality. Dozens of innocent Ambazonians have been taken from their homes in the early hours of the morning, another dark day in the calendar of a people under siege. In what is being described by eyewitnesses and human rights advocates as a mass abduction operation, French Cameroon colonial forces have stormed the villages of Mautu and Oweh in southern Cameroon's Ambazonia, arresting scores of innocent civilians in a violent crackdown known locally as Kalekale. And according to local sources, heavily armed troops invaded residential communities at dawn, dragging young men and women from their homes without warrant or formal charges. The victims, many of whom are reportedly farmers, students, and local traders, they have been whisked away to unknown locations. According to a village elder said this is not an arrest operation, it is a coordinated kidnapping for ransom. A village elder from Mautu, who narrowly escaped the raid and is not new to such attacks, said they come under the guise of law enforcement, but what they really do is extort, torture, and in many cases kill the peoples of Ambazonia. Now, this disturbing event comes amidst growing concerns over systematic human rights abuses perpetrated by the colonial regime of La Republique du Cameroon, particularly in Ambazonian territories, where the indigenous population has resisted assimilation and occupation for years now. Videos and images shared by survivors and activists show women wailing, homes ransacked, and terrified children watching as their fathers and older brothers are loaded onto military trucks. This wave of Kalekale is said to be among the most aggressive seen this year. Amazonian civil society groups, families of the abducted, the human rights defenders are calling on the international community to intervene immediately to stop further atrocities and pressure the La Republique regime to release those detained. We are calling on all Ambazonians at home and in the diaspora to rise in unity, a community spokesperson declared. These are our sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. If we do not speak out and act now, we risk losing more lives to this cruel occupation. Now, Kalekale, which is the mass arbitrary arrest, has become a notorious tactic used by La Republique forces to suppress dissent, intimidate locals, and extort money from poor families under the threat of prolonged detention or death. Victims are often tortured in detention, denied medical access, and only released after bribes, more like ransoms, are being paid. International observers and watchdog groups have repeatedly condemned these actions as violations of international humanitarian law. But La Republique authorities continue with impunity. The glaring question is, what can be done now? And to answer that, we see the immediate calls which are already being made for legal aid and local advocacy teams to locate and demand access to the detained. Ambazonian humanitarian networks to also provide psychological, financial, and logistical support to the affected families. International human rights organizations to pressure La Republique and demand accountability. Peace mobilization, public protest, and diplomatic lobbying to expose these crimes and demand the release of all abducted persons. Well, these are the suggestions of the human rights activists in and around Ambazonia. But then we'll leave the story with a question one young woman from Oweh tearfully asked. How many more will be taken before the world listens? How many more? In a recent development, it is obvious La Republic's lawlessness has indeed reached not just global borders, but this time spiritual authorities on the global stage. Well, in his first official address to journalists at the Vatican, Pope Leo XIVs issued a powerful call for the release of journalists imprisoned across the globe, including Ambazonian journalists held in the dungeons of La Republique du Cameroon. The Pope emphasized the indispensable role of the media in defending truth and upholding human dignity. His remarks come amid growing global concern over the steady decline of press freedom, particularly in countries like the Cameroon, which has earned notoriety as one of Africa's most repressive environments for journalists. Now, speaking in the poll, Sixth Audience Hall, the newly elected head of the Catholic Church declared his solidarity with journalists in prison for seeking and reporting the truth, adding that their suffering challenges the consciences of nations and the international community. Coming from the Pope and given that La Republic's nonagenarian dictator, Paul Biya, is a Catholic, many observers are watching closely to see if the regime will respond to this moral appeal from its spiritual leader. Pope Leo XV described press freedom as a precious gift that must be defended at all costs and urged journalists to promote unity rather than division. He says we do not need loud, forceful communication, but rather communication that is capable of listening and of gathering the voices of the weak, those who have no voice. He also addressed the ethical dilemmas posed by modern technologies, warning that artificial intelligence requires responsibility and discernment to ensure it serves humanity rather than divide humanity. While La Republique, amongst Africa's worst offenders, is still in the news, with the Pope's call resonating deeply in Central Africa, particularly in Ambazonia, where La Republique continues to imprison, silence, and even kill journalists for doing their jobs, despite officials' claim that journalists operate with complete freedom and safety. International watchdogs report a starkly different reality. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ, Cameroon ranks as the second worst jailer of journalists in Africa, behind only Eritrea. Now, as of 2024, at least 3 Ambazonian journalists remain behind bars, often convicted under vague repressive laws designed to stifle dissent and muzzle the press. People such as Samuel Wazizi and Martin Ezogo died under suspicious circumstances while in custody. Deaths that drew global condemnation and cast further doubt on the safety of media workers in La Republique and Ambazonia. Colonial authorities often point to the existence of hundreds of registered media outlets as evidence of press freedom, but critics argue that this is mere window dressing, masking a regime where media plurality exists alongside violent repression, arbitrary arrest, and censorship.
The suffering of these imprisoned journalists challenges the conscience of nations and the international community, calling on all of us to safeguard the precious gift of free speech and of the press. Today, one of the most important challenges is to promote communication that can bring us out of the Tower of Babel, in which we sometimes find ourselves, out of the confusion of loveless languages that are often ideological or partisan, calling each one of you to strive for a different kind of communication, one that does not seek consensus at all costs, does not use aggressive words, does not follow the culture of competition, and never separates the search for truth from the love with which we must humbly seek it.
Well, this address is not just symbolic. It serves as a global indictment of regimes like La Republique du Cameroon, where journalism has become a dangerous profession. The Pope's voice adds moral weight to mounting evidence that La Republique's claim to press freedom is a facade, and helps explain why Cameroon continues to rank amongst the world's worst offenders when it comes to imprisoning journalists. Now, as calls for the release of Ambazonian journalists grow louder, the international community faces a clear question: Will it continue to look away, or will it act to protect the guardians of truth? Well, with that, we head on to the news around Africa. On the African scene, Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traore recently criticized French media during a visit to Moscow, accusing them of brainwashing African people. The statement reflects the growing tensions between Burkina Faso and France, particularly regarding media representation and influence.
Understand their history and wake up. So that's our fight as well. My biggest regret is having spent a good part of my youth listening to radio stations like RFI and France 24. I've been in countries where those radio stations were shut down. But we would use apps to record their news broadcasts so we could listen. But at some point, something clicked. I started to realize that they were conditioning our minds to accept what they wanted. It's their narrative that they want us to learn. And since then, I've started to see things for what they are. And I understood that what they're doing is very dangerous. And today, more than ever, I realize that they have conditioned the minds, especially of Africans. So you can play a big role in awakening the consciousness of young people so that people understand how the world works and don't let themselves be led astray by those people. When we watch the parade of the machines that won the war, that is the T-34s up to the modern vehicles, it shows us the technological evolution of the Russian army. And it inspires us as well to get to work so that we can develop in the same direction. Relations are going very well. And I can say that for the past 2 years now, things have started off very well. And we are working on deepening the areas of defense and security, but also education and later on the commercial sector and other aspects. So we have staggered the different areas so that we can exchange a lot and share many experiences, because we also have a lot to learn from Russia in the field of education, especially in the sciences. Now, it must be said that up to today, gold is the main export product in Burkina Faso. But we have set agriculture in motion, first for self-sufficiency, but also for foreign trade and export. The terrorists are reinforced by many foreign fighters who come from elsewhere, who are not, in fact. If I take the case of Burkina Faso, there are many criminals in Burkina Faso, but they are not Burkinabe. There are also trainers who come from many countries to teach them a lot of techniques.
But what is their interest?
It's not really terrorism, it's imperialism. Their goal is to keep us in a state of permanent war, so that we cannot develop and so they can continue to plunder our resources. So they have every interest in bringing in specialists in mines to lay various types of mines and explosives experts. Today, the terrorists use drones to fight and everything. So these are professionals from certain countries who come to teach them all of this. All of this is to keep us in a state of insecurity. But we are aware of the situation. We adapt each time to their methods of operation, and we will continue the fight until we have recovered the entirety of the Sahel. So all the countries that are fighting today for their more economic independence, we are trying to collaborate better with these countries.
That video, courtesy of Fox Local, shows Traore's comment suggesting he believes French media are manipulating public opinion in Africa, potentially shaping narratives that don't favor Burkina Faso's interest or similar anti-imperialist movements on the continent of Africa. Now, the sentiment resonates with some Africans who feel that Western media outlets often present biased or incomplete views of African issues to portray their narrative. For his accusation, French media is accused of brainwashing African people, implying a deliberate attempt to manipulate public opinion. Now, the context of the tensions show that Burkina Faso has been experiencing strained relations with France, partly due to its efforts to distance itself from French influence and align more closely with other global powers like Russia. We see the role of media in shaping public perception is significant, and Traore's statement highlights the importance of diverse and independent media voices in Africa. Well, it is worth noting that some media outlets like Agence France Presse, the AFP, have been accused of serving as mouthpieces for French government interests, given that they receive substantial funding from the French government. This perceived lack of neutrality can fuel skepticism. It fuels skepticism about their reporting on sensitive topics, including geopolitical shifts in Africa. He calls out the hypocrisy of Western powers, the exploitation of Black leaders to undermine African progress, and the destructive role of foreign troops on African soil. With clarity and conviction, Traore's outline of his vision for a sovereign, united, and self-reliant Africa, driven by a strong military, industrial development, and a new generation of awakened African youth, only helps inspire other African nationalist leaders. While still on the African scene, we see a group of 59 white South Africans, mostly farmers, arrived in the United States on Monday, granted refugee status under a relocation program initiated by the Trump administration. Now, this move has sparked sharp criticism from South African leaders and scholars who dispute the qualification of refugees for these individuals. The Trump administration justified fast-tracking applications from white South Africans, citing alleged racial discrimination and threats on the South Africa's land reform initiatives. The United States government claims these individuals are targets of persecution in their homeland. However, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa rejects these claims, stating that those leaving for the United States do not fit the definition of refugees. Ramaphosa emphasized that the departing individuals are not being persecuted, hounded, or treated badly. He expressed his objections to Trump, saying, "We think the American government has got the wrong end of the stick here." The South African government maintains that its land reform efforts aim to address historical injustices, not persecute anyone. Now, human rights advocates and refugee organizations have condemned the move, describing it as ideologically and racially motivated. Jeremy Konedig, president of Refugees International, stated that this is a racialized immigration program masquerading as refugee resettlement. Now, critics argue that this policy prioritizes a historically privileged minority over genuinely vulnerable populations. This program has raised concerns about the Trump administration's selective admissions processes, with many questioning the ethics and legality of the policy. As more Afrikaners prepare to relocate under this program, it is likely to face growing scrutiny, both domestically and internationally. And now for the rest of the news across the globe, we'll take a quick break.
Sovereign Silhouette. the emblem of Ambazonia. From the azure embrace of the Atlantic reflecting from the Ambas Bay, the iconic Fako Mountain ascends with a silent, stoic grace, carving a silhouette against the sky. This towering sentinel is more than a geographical marvel. It is the heart of southern Cameroons, the stoic guardian of Ambazonia, a symbol steadfast as the unyielding spirit manifests in the unity of the land's 13 counties. And
The last 4 reports we see the Russian-Ukraine war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has raised the stakes ahead of potential talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Turkey. Zelensky insists he'll only meet with Putin himself, refusing to hold discussions with any other Russian representative. The potential meeting comes after Kyiv's European allies issued a ceasefire or sanctions ultimatum to Moscow. Putin agreed to direct talks in Turkey in response to this ultimatum. Zelensky is adamant about meeting Putin directly, stating he'll travel to Turkey to do so. Zelensky has expressed willingness to meet Putin personally in Turkey, indicating Ukraine's openness to negotiations. Ukraine is reportedly open to ceasefire talks in Istanbul, with Zelensky confirming his readiness to meet Putin. It's worth noting that the reported urging United States President Donald Trump to meet Putin seems unusual, given that current United States president is more commonly associated with diplomatic efforts in Ukraine. Now, with that, we've come to the end of the news on Undaunted tonight, but of course, before we go, we'll take a look at the recap. Well, on Undaunted tonight, we saw a young man found dead after being pulled out of a drinking joint for drinking brasseries brewed beer. And we wondered if that was another tactic of La Republique to cause a divide and conquer system, causing division amongst Ambazonian genuine liberation fighters with this narrative. We also saw the Mbororo militias poised to invade Ambazonia from Nigeria with backing of La Republique. We saw La Republique forces launching another wave of Kalekale in Mautu and Oweh, with dozens abducted in broad daylight arbitrarily. Pope Leo XIV called for the release of detained Ambazonian journalists in La Republique dungeons, as well as other African nations. And focusing on the African scene, we saw Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traore slamming the French media outlets and calling them out for their hypocrisy. For the rest of the news across the globe, white South Africans arrived in the United States amidst controversy over refugee status and racial segregation. And with that, we've come to the end of Undaunted tonight, bringing into the news untold stories. On behalf of my co-anchors and the entire Undaunted team, we say thank you for tuning in. We leave you with ABC Amba TV images. Good night and God bless you.